Our next session, as I said, is going to dive much more deeply into the question of will AI help or hinder socially, culturally responsible assessment? And this conversation, I'm honored to say, will be moderated by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who is she probably needs no introduction. She's an award-winning author and educator and the former president of Spelman College and my colleague on the board of trustees at ETS.
Thank you so much, Candace, and it's a delight to be here. Good morning, everyone. As you heard, I'm Beverly Daniel Tatum. My panelists are coming out, and it's an honor to moderate this conversation. We will be focusing on a central tension, as she said, in the use of AI for assessment. Can AI meaningfully advance socioculturally responsible assessment, or does it risk reinforcing and scaling existing inequities? AI introduces new possibilities for personalization, contextualization, and performance-based measurement, and at the same time, it raises serious concerns about bias, validity, fairness, and differential impact across learners from a range of sociocultural backgrounds. Our goal in this session is to move beyond optimism or skepticism to a more nuanced, evidence-based discussion of conditions under which AI helps or harms socioculturally responsible assessment. And I am joined by 4 fabulous panelists. I'm going to introduce each of them, and then they'll say a little bit more about themselves as we start. To my immediate left is Kadria Ershikhan, Senior Vice President, Global Research, leading the ETS Research Institute. And we have with us Temple Lovelace, she's representing Assessment for Good, an R&D program housed at the Advanced Education Research Development Foundation, known as AIRDIF. And next to Temple is Nancy Otero, Senior Program Officer for AI and Assessment at the Gates Foundation. And finally, we have Brian Brown, holding up the Stanford banner here, Kamalachari Professor of Science Education here at Stanford in the School of Education. To briefly describe the flow of our conversation, I like to think of it as having 3 parts. I call them what, so what, and now what. So that's kind of the flow that we've got here. And I've told you a little bit about the what, but we need to get more specific. And in particular, the topic of assessment, as you all know, is quite broad and means different things to different people. Is it formative? Is it summative? Is it individualized? Is it large scale? Is it, all of that. So I've asked each of our panelists to do a brief introduction to talk a little bit about their version of assessment, what brings them to this conversation as a way of orienting us to their particular perspective, and we will take it from there, and we'll just go down the line here. So Kadria, would you start?
Yes. Thank you so much, Beverly, and thanks, Candace and Stanford School of Education for hosting us here. In addition to my role as the Senior Vice President for Global Research at ETS, I'm a former academic, Professor Emerita from the University of British Columbia, Canada. And I spent about 4 decades of my career focusing on validity and fairness issues in assessments, both large-scale assessments and formative assessments, classroom-based assessments, taking into account social and cultural contexts of individuals. Before I forget, I also should prove that I did remember something from Dan's speech. It's very nice to be back in Cumberland, 1991 graduate, research and evaluation methods. And both Ingram Olkin and Lee Kronbach, faculty of the program that I graduated from, and in fact, Ingram was one of my advisors. The research I've been doing on validity and fairness issues, and in particular, taking diversity, heterogeneity of populations in general, has critical relevance to our current context, integrating AI into assessment. So I'm really, this topic is very close to my heart. At ETS, our ETS Research Institute researchers are focusing on foundational and innovation research programs in innovating teaching, learning, and assessment in our current technological context, and integrating AI into these fundamental elements of education in responsible ways. So thank you.
Thank you, Kajia Temple.
Yes, I will echo the thanks for the invitation. I come to assessment through education, or specifically through special education. I don't know if those of us who are close to assessment and measurement were ever 8 or 9 when they said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" We're like, "We want to be somebody in assessment." Often what happens is we fall into it, right? And so for me as a special educator, I had to think every day about what happens when learning doesn't match the learning curve of learners, don't necessarily match what they say it matches. What do we do? What do we change on the ground in the moment when it comes to assessment and learning? And so I think about the role of assessment as something actually quite simple. It's something that, what a learner is able to do, but they show you what they know. And every kid wants to show you what they know. They get excited to show you what they know. And so if we think about assessment being that, what happens when we say assessment, they're like, I don't know, And so for me, I think about the role of assessment as communication, which was talked about earlier, as a way to have this shared understanding. One of my best dear friends in the world, who's 104, Dr. Edmund Gordon, he talks about learning persons and teaching persons, and that educators and learners can be either at any moment. So for me, assessment is something that is personal. It is something that is simple. It is something that is really thinks about learning trajectories and how do we make better decisions. And so that's how I come to assessment. That's what I think about assessment. That's the lens I bring to assessment, is that idea of just plain connection across learning persons and teaching persons.
Thank you.
Wow,
Nancy.
that sounds beautiful and very inspirational. So I'm Nancy Otero. I'm a senior program officer for the Gates Foundation on the Assessment Initiative. I'm also very happy to be here, getting something about like the imposter syndrome right now. But I think it's very exciting for me to start witnessing how the domain of assessment has the opportunity to transform themselves right now. Not in a disruptive way, but more in a way that we are learning from whatever we have built before. At the Gates Foundation, we think about assessment in a very practical way. We go from interim to formative assessments in the classroom to more like a system measurements that can provide us information on how to improve schools, to emergent technologies and approaches that can transform or complement these summative models. And what we care about is that all this data that we're providing is meaningful, usable, timely for the people that are going to use it, educators and strictly school leaders. And that at the end of the day, this assessment help students to get better outcomes. So that's kind of my hat right now.
Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here. So my work, I'm a science educator. I'm going to preemptively apologize. I'm only going to talk about science. I don't know anything else. We think of assessment as a tool. So every summer when we train our science teachers, we start with 3 tools for being a better teacher. And it is in the context of being a culturally relevant science teacher. It is pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. But we spend most of our time talking about pre-assessment and formative assessment. And here's a very simple reason. If I'm going to teach you in a culturally empowering way, which means I want to know what you know, and I want to know where you know it. Teachers struggle with this. How am I going to know where my students know about these science ideas? We have a very simple answer to that question. Just ask them. If you ask them, they will tell you. And so pre-assessment becomes an invaluable tool because you start by empowering young people to communicate what they know, where they know it. So we start with this rich framework. And then in formative assessment, as they're learning, we want them to talk about it because it's where they learn. So formative assessment for us is not the teacher measuring, it's also the students coming across three very real phenomena. I know that I know I don't know, or I know one part and this other part is unclear. That's a great place to be. So I say that to say, I come to this conversation to say if teachers are doing that as the core of their training, let's really be world-class at formative and summit and pre-assessment, then the digital tools that are emerging can really help us be better at instruction.
Great. Thank you all for setting that context in terms of your own work. So in that, now that we have that as background, I'd like to ask the question, how does AI help or hinder socioculturally responsive assessment? But we obviously have to clarify what we mean by that phrase. What is socioculturally responsive assessment? What does success look like? So, Kudria, I'm going to ask you to start us off with that. What does success look like from your point of view? If we are truly socioculturally responsive in our assessment, what does that look like?
Great question. I first want to start with defining what I mean by sociocultural responsiveness. There are different definitions out there, overlapping definitions, obviously. The way I think about sociocultural responsiveness is grounding assessments, all aspects of assessments, in individuals' cultural, linguistic, and societal backgrounds. This does mean taking into account how we define what we're trying to measure, the construct that we're trying to measure, whether that means different things for individuals who may have been learning, whether it's science or mathematics or another disciplinary area in different ways in their cultural context. It also means taking into account how we design assessment tasks, as well as how we interpret responses. Why do we want to do that? To really promote motivation of individuals, optimize their engagement and performance. And I want to highlight something that the field has really recognized. Field of measurement and more broadly, education has recognized the importance of context, societal and cultural context for learning and assessment. However, I don't think we've done enough to move the needle in really addressing how we do this. I want to highlight that when individuals, students come to an assessment context, an assessment situation, whether it's the classroom assessment context or a large-scale assessment context in a group setting, they not only bring what they have learned, what they know, what they're able to do in that assessment context, but their full self. And that full self includes their histories, family histories, home context, societal context. Beverly talks about this in her book. As an individual, as a member of a group, what they have experienced, discrimination, racism, any other societal challenges that they may have experienced, they bring all of that in historically, but as well as right before what breakfast they had, if they had breakfast, into that assessment context situation. So this affects how they relate to the assessment, what they value about the assessment, what their motivation, their engagement, how they engage, and how they make sense of the assessment situation. The meaning of the words, the way that assessment tasks are presented to them, whether the context, whether the graphic, or even paper-based versus digital interactivity, their familiarity with the format of the assessment. All of these affect how they respond to test questions. So what we see in an assessment, responses to assessment tasks, is in fact a complex interaction of what individuals bring to the assessment and many aspects of that assessment. Not only format, but how it's been presented to them and so on and so forth. So our field of measurement has really, for decades now, been working on creating a playing even field for individuals taking tests. And standardization has been positioned to create that equivalent testing conditions for individuals. But what we understand from this complex interaction between the individual and the assessment is that these are never equivalent testing conditions. So sociocultural responsiveness attempts or creates the pathway to deviating from standardization with the goal of optimizing every individual's engagement, their motivation, and ultimately their performance on the assessment, which can have huge implications for their opportunities and success.
Sure.
I hope that's helpful.
Well, definitely. We're going to come back in a minute to sort of how AI inserts into what you've just said. But I know that others on this panel want to weigh in. And Nancy, I'm going to come to you.
I think it's very important to recognize, as you said, that assessments are something that is a cultural construct, right? And the way that we are describing right now assessment is that these learners go and do something that we're asking them to do because we're trying to measure something that we think is important. And I wonder also how we can include, these learners into the design of these assessments. We can include their families into the design of these assessments. And we can also go beyond of measuring what we perceive that is important right now and go and try to measure also what the kids want to know about themselves. I think, as we see that AI is coming as a fast trend into our system, not just education, but like all the social life that we have, one of the questions that sometimes I have is like, we use all this assessment to try to get measurements that are very homogeneous and very comparable and use it as a language that is very important for us to communicate about learning, obviously. But I wonder also how we can use now this assessment to also try to measure a little bit like what makes children and learners unique and how that can be a construct in our assessment. And I wonder if AI can help us to capture some of this more uniqueness that learners have.
Great. How about you, Temple? What does success look like?
Oh, wow. That's a that's a big question. To me, what I think success looks like is actually, as I look at this title, socioculturally responsible. Yes, sociocultural, nature, and how we think about that is critically important. I think about, though, what that means as being responsible to that and for that, and what are the conditions, what are the things we need to think about. So how do we use these assessment opportunities and measurement to actually expand what that means? When I think about, how culture is shaped over time and how we need to modernize our understandings of things, that's how I think about the promise that exists here. That success looks like me, Temple, who was being able to be understood by that task or that tool. Not that I had to twist myself in a pretzel to get the right answer, but that the task and tool was created in a way that I could show up as my full self to that assessment opportunity, and that that tool or that person was able to capture, bring that out to understand then what decisions do we need to make next, and that even myself as a learner, we're successful when learners also are able to be self-regulated in their approach. They can chart their own paths through learning. And so for me, when I think about socioculturally responsible and what success looks like, it's bringing more of that into the equation, and thinking about the role of context. I agree, as something that can be measured, should be measured. We should understand those impacts. We have to modernize our base level understandings of what those things mean, so that our science can catch up to our capabilities.
So, Brian, when you were talking about pre-assessment and the importance of that, it seemed to me you were pointing us in a direction of what success might look like. Do you want to expand on that before we insert AI to this conversation?
Sure. So let me start. I'm going to start with instruction, and then I want to invert it to assessment. So if we're going to empower students, an assessment is measuring what they know, but it is always contextualized to where they know it. So I want to teach you in the way that is unforgettable. So if I'm going to teach you about let's say, osmosis, I'm going to teach you about something that I think where you might experience it. So if I live in New York and I'm shopping at a bodega, they're not spraying the vegetables in the grocery store. I lived in Michigan and they have these huge grocery stores. They're spraying these dead vegetables because they want them to look fresh. I want to teach it in that context because as you see it, you can't forget invaluable, important information, if that makes sense. So assessment can take us the other direction. Where might they have experienced osmosis? I can then ask them about this content and the context that really lets them know this is important. Now, the challenge for an educator is I've got to figure out, because I wasn't taught that way, where might these young people have learned this particular science or experienced it, and I'm designing lessons accordingly. I think empowering assessment can do that. It's not great. I've tried it. It can figure out how to contextualize if you import information that speaks to where the students are. So the shortest answer of that, how I can get to it, is to say, if we have an assessment that can point to where students know what they know, it can empower them. And there's another layer. There's cues that you can embed. Who's communicating, how you're communicating, and where you're communicating. It is an incredible place, I think, that we can head in assessment.
So we've heard slightly different versions of what success might look like across the panel, but now the question is, how does AI help us achieve that success? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I'll paint a little picture maybe to get us kicked off. Yeah. I want you to think about a third grade classroom. I'll give you two settings, either a third grade classroom or an after school maker space where they are preparing for next week's robotics club. Okay, so pick your setting. I want you to think about what you hear. What do you see? As you walk over to a table or crouch down on the floor, what can you touch? What are learners touching? How are they engaging? For me, when I think about the power of AI, I want to be able to measure that in that moment. Right now, the majority of our assessment tasks ask them to stop that, then go somewhere else and do something to tell us what they were just doing when they were in action. So this idea of being able to assess while learners are going through the process of learning is what I think AI brings us to the promise of, that we're able to measure new things, measure things in different ways, update our computational models so that we can capture the richness and the uniqueness that's there. And so for me, it's about how does AI allow us to assess the learning process in the moment so that learning can continue while we're assessing versus what happens in too many instances right now, which is we have to stop learning in order to assess and then go back and learn. And so for me, that's what I hope sits on the frontier of where machine learning and more generative approaches can support our learning process. So they're not so divorced anymore, but they actually become unique and almost undistinguishable from each other.
Yes, Kadria.
Yes,
Thank you.
I want to add to what Temple just shared. Whole technology and engaging learners in digital environments and embedding assessment tasks or ways of capturing data the way so provides insights about how they're going about their learning and where they may need support in moving to the next step is all very helpful. I want to highlight one of the benefits from for sociocultural responsiveness lens, and that is making it possible to personalize assessments. The previous panel highlighted the importance of personalization to support individuals' growth and learning. And AI is now making it possible for us to really align assessment tasks, their context, but possibly their format, mode to their individuals' preferences and with familiar formats and so on and so forth. So personalization aligned with individuals' cultural, linguistic, societal context, as well as their individual preferences, is one way of bringing us closer to social cultural responsiveness.
Nancy?
So I'm going to give 3 examples that we are investing that, is trying to move forward this vision that you both are mentioning. We are investing in like a Khan Academy. And one of the sorry, and one of the things that we're looking at is that they are able to embed something that helps kids to explain what they are thinking when they're answering something. And it's in a conversational kind of like way. They are doing it with Canmigo. Of course, this is the beginning of something, right? But we're starting to see like, okay, can we, through these conversations, this allowance of language in a more interactive way, start capturing some of these things? And this is very early on, as we know, right? Like we need to start, thinking about the psychometrics of these sorts of like assessments. Another example is like a collaboration with ETS that is doing the skills for the future. And the idea is that what else can we capture? Not just how, like in the conversational way, but like what other skills can we capture? And one of the things I find it very interesting is that they're allowing kids to upload when they have to show their mastery on like communication or collaboration or critical thinking, something also that is outside the classroom. So, we're trying to bring experiences that are not just in the classroom, that are like maybe more cultural relevant for these students inside a construct and try to get some information out of it, which I think is like extremely, maybe in the right direction. And the other one is that we are funding also a researcher from Stanford, Shima Salehi, and she has a chatbot for teaching problem-solving skills. And we are thinking about what are the public goods that we can create that would allow researchers like her that have something that is, not very scalable yet, but AI can, hint of how we can scale it, into create public goods such as chatbots, evaluators, data sets that are annotated into the field of assessment and say like, okay, now can you do something with this? How can we bridge these very, non-scalable, very cool assessments into something that maybe can be useful for the field of assessments?
I want to share that Dr. P and I have been working on a project for the last year and a half on creating a culturally relevant AI lab teacher. And one of the features is formative assessment. So formative assessment is difficult for a teacher. Many of you remember, you may have seen Fist to Five, where they have every kid raise their hand, or they're passing out stickies, or they take index cards. Now the teacher has to read these 30 responses and make a real-time decision about how do I respond tomorrow. One of the things that we found fairly effective is that in a small group setting, the students can communicate one-to-one with the AI bot and get real-time feedback. We've tried to train it to essentially a sandwich model to say, here's what I like about what you responded. Here's a corrective action, and then a new question. So it repeats a cycle of conversation. I think what's been really impressive is its consistency. It is going to be more consistent than a teacher. It is always going to affirm an answer. It is always going to ask a question, but that can be really annoying to kids who are like, stop asking me questions.
Right.
I want to keep moving. So there's a consistency that has some value. And the other part is it's a subtle component. Is I can cue to the person that they're supposed to be involved in science by picking a bot that really looks like them, or just giving them the option to do so. So for me, I think there's a great deal of potential in formative assessment if we can build cycles that really reflect how teachers communicate, which we're finding is very difficult. And we're also finding that although AI bot, you can point it in a predictive direction, it can give you good examples. You have to program those examples for the bot. Otherwise, it will be inaccurate, and it will try to make analogies that are just unnatural. So that takes some time.
Yeah. Well, if that's the promise, what's the risk? What could go wrong? Andrea, you look like you're ready.
I'll take that. So first to acknowledge, there's a lot that we can do. But I also think that to do it responsibly and in a way that really meets the goals of assessment, we need to pay attention to the risks. Multiple risks, but I'm going to categorize them in 2 buckets. one is related to one set of risks are associated with the efficacy of these AI tool applications, the extent to which the tools meet intended goals. And the second category is related to this, and this is the part that I think is really relevant to fairness: differential efficacy. In other words, tools work for some people, or they work differently for different groups of people or for individuals. And I'll provide a bit of a measurement context with regards to the efficacy question. There are many applications of AI in assessment right now. I'm going to focus on using AI for scoring purposes. First, AI scoring is probably the most widely used application of AI in the world of assessment. It's also the basis of several other applications of AI. For example, providing feedback relies on how student responses are evaluated. And even though a score may not be reported, that feedback is ultimately relies on that evaluation. It includes adaptivity in assessment, AI-based adaptivity, AI-based interactivity, and so on and so forth. So I think, and also some of the examples that I'm going to give can happen in like content generation and other applications as well. So one of the risks of how AI may not meet its intended purposes, in other words, it may not provide accurate indicators of performance, is by including what's called in measurement construct irrelevant variance. And what that means is capturing aspects of the performance that's really not intended by the assessment. And I'm going to give an example from science, from a science assessment. So if in a science assessment, the AI scoring tool is really rewarding language competency as opposed to the actual scientific reasoning, this can create construct irrelevant variance, which is at the core of bias in assessments. Another way this can happen is what we call in measurement construct underrepresentation. And this is very common as well, whether AI scoring tools are machine learning based or large language model based, that the AI scoring is capturing only one aspect of what we're trying to measure. For example, going back to the science assessment example, that it's measuring, it's actually capturing recall or factual knowledge and not really getting into the more complex reasoning, complex skills. So all of these ultimately would be construct irrelevant variance, construct underrepresentation, shifts away from being an accurate indicator of the scores. And this can happen for everyone, not just one group or some of the individuals. And then differential efficacy. The construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevant variance happening in different ways for different groups of individuals from different cultural backgrounds, societal backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, as well as educational settings where if they've learned some science content in different ways, and ultimately creating a bias in the scores that have been a result of this AI application. And this has significant implications for education, where scores are used, which tasks are selected for assessments, as well as how over time might impact what gets taught in the classroom and how decisions are made.
Temple, you look like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I don't know if I will say that it's more of
Thank
a
you for sharing.
caution, and it's less about the capability, and it's more about us in this room. I think AI is not going to be the silver bullet that erases what we already know is wrong with assessment. And I think a lot of times, some of our earlier conversations were really about let's just automate it and make it faster and make the decision faster when we had original things that we needed to ask of assessment and how we did it. And so for me, I think about the promise of AI being a place where we can actually go back and question some of the things about measurement, about assessment, about the assessment process to fix or to continue to innovate in ways that actually make learning a bit more accessible, have it honor who learners are in the moment. One of the things we do at AFG is ask the big questions. Like we try to add assessment for good, which is at AIRDF. We try to ask big questions and take big swings. And so one of the things that the educators who co-design with us have asked us is that they really have not trouble, but they worry about that next decision. Education Weekly talked about the fact that educators make like 1,400 to 1,600 decisions every single day. That's a lot of decisions. And so they worry about what should I teach next? What should I make available next? And so for us at AFG, we've been really thinking about less about assessment as our focus in the last few months, but more about learning. And how do we think about customizing what should come next, customizing the core so it's not so common, but we're able to think about rearranging learning pieces in different ways. And then how does assessment tell us what should come next? And so for me, it is a lot about, what should we be wary of, but we also want to meet that with an answer of where we can innovate next in order to hopefully continue to push the field forward.
Right. I just want to say, before we go further, that we are rapidly running out of time. And so I want to ask two very specific questions, and one is for Brian, and then I'm coming to you, Nancy, okay? So Brian, one of the things that I know you and I talked about when we were preparing has to do with this whole question of comparability, interpretability across, if everything's personalized, how can you really compare if you want to make comparisons? And how do inequities in access to technology enter into that conversation?
So for me, that I've always had a concern that when you introduce a technology and people are passive users of that technology and don't get an opportunity to create, you create a generation of people who don't have access to the technology that could empower their communities. And so for me, for example, if you're developing a large language model, who's developing that language model? And the language matters. So it is a language model, a mode of communication. But for me, I know teachers communicate in a much different approach. I'm never communicating in a one unidirectional way. I'm always just trying to get the young person to talk. And then when they're communicating, I'm listening across dialects, across language. What do they know? How can I empower them to continue to communicate on their pathway to being a proficient learner? Well, large language models are general language models. They're not designed to communicate and think like a teacher. So that always concerns me. On the other side is this notion of culture. What we know, what we do, what we experience is AI has to make decisions about cultural cues. And is it informed enough to not make sweeping, stereotypical, generalist assessments of who the people are that they're communicating? And that ultimately concerns me because that is reflected in who's designing the software and how often people engage with the software to challenge it so it can improve. So broadly, if we have a generation here, Silicon Valley, of people using language models, who's training, what are the job opportunities? And so I'm ultimately concerned that we are going to magnify inequality by not making sure everyone has access.
So thank you. And the question that comes naturally to me and in our time is how do we put guardrails around that? And Nancy, as a funder, I know that one of the things you've been thinking about is how do we create accountability in this fast-moving context in which we're all operating?
Yeah, such an important question. And I don't know if I have the answer, but these are a few ideas. I think one of the things that we need to focus is to say, what are the things that we want to amplify? What are the lessons that we have learned from other technologies that has come and we have maybe not do it correctly and have damaged or not be fair with all the population in general. And besides the technology, what are the ideas that we need to get rid of and redesign? And can this be an opportunity for that? I see a lot of, in the assessment world, like people are starting to focus on efficiency. We are just going to use this technology to score faster, to do more multiple choice questions. And we also have in the other side of the equation, IB schools or like other types of assessment that are like inquiry-based, grade assessment, portfolio-based assessments. And we just want to amplify maybe more of that and maybe less of the other part of the efficiency, just for that sake. So I will invite the investors to like think about like what are the very rich context assessments that we're designing, or we are like going for more like efficiency gains. And also the transparency is very important. I think we still need researchers to tell us like what is good evidence that this is like a very good assessment that is capturing what we want to capture, and to tell us when do we feel that these are some measurements or evidence what is going in the wrong direction. So I think funding projects that can give us more light on that is very important. I think developers also have a responsibility here to help us scale what we want to scale, at the same time provide transparency of how these models are working, what are the guardrails that are needed, and also invest on those sorts of like developments. I think it's going to be very important. I think we need to, start thinking all of us as a new way of what is the accountability that we need for this, and where are the venues where we can talk about it, design it, and be very clear that we want to be accountable not just for the technology, for what we want to amplify with the technology, and we also be accountable for the opportunities that we will lose if we don't take this time to redesign some of the assessment processes.
Thanks. In the couple minutes we have left, I want to give each of you a chance to share a closing reflection. And I want to remind the audience that at the beginning, Candace said these panels are intended to be conversation starters. So I hope that we've given you something to talk about. But here, I'm going to ask each person to, what takeaway from this conversation do you want this audience to be thinking about as they move into small groups later?
Lots of thoughts. But one follow-up thought to Nancy is that this community here has a lot of responsibility and leverage in how we shape AI is applied in education through our research, through creating guardrails, guidelines, and demanding that in applications, evidence is provided with regards to validity, fairness, efficacy, and equivalent efficacy across groups. And bring it back to Chromebox Alpha. Chromebox Alpha is now expected for every operational assessment, or some version of a reliability index is expected when assessments are used for commercial purposes. We should have similar kinds of expectations for AI applications that clearly communicate about validity, fairness, efficacy, and equivalence of efficacy.
Thank you.
Yeah, a few words. Think big. Think about the future. Think about equity. Think about inclusion. Think about opportunity. Think about access.
Maybe just an invitation for all of us to think beyond the chatbot and see AI as a more like an environment where we can play with and maybe move towards assessment in that way as well.
I want to make an ask. Can you build for my science teacher colleagues pre-assessment tools where they can better understand what students know, where they know it? And I would love for you to also build formative assessment tools and make them open source so that our science teachers can do a better job of helping students know where they are. So I would love to see those. Send me an email when you build it. We're happy to use it. So good luck.
Please join me in thanking this panel. Thank you so much.